Hi, Tanya, and welcome to the Counterfeit Sleep Podcast.
Hi, Tara Clancy. I am so delighted to be with you here this afternoon.
Well, I am so delighted that you are here with me because we have been doing special episodes in honor of National Mental Health Month. And I think your topic is right on target for us right now, given everything that we've been going through. I've had the pleasure of hearing you speak and giving your perspective prescription talk, which knocked my socks off. I mean, you just did such a wonderful job of really illustrating it and making it concrete, beautifully done. And so, what I was hoping we could talk about today is grief in particular, because with everything that's been going on, we have had so much loss, economic loss, actual social and relational loss, actual death. And so many people are walking around in a state of grief and having different levels of awareness of it and different levels of how to cope. So I was hoping that you may be able to shed some light on that for us.
I think you're right, and I think everybody's talking about it, and it's no surprise. And yet, I think to some people, it is a surprise that it actually is grief because we usually think of grief just in terms of death. And I think the whole world learned that there are many ways to go through grief, and certainly we've all had a loss of our freedoms, it feels like. Um, and I think, right in line with that. I have to say, the topic of grief is the topic of the book that I'm going to launch in August. And I lost my partner on New Year's Eve of 2018. So I was in grief already before this pandemic came along. And I have to say that when it first happened, I really experienced other people's reactions and recognize them as grief because I was already there. I was
Mm,
already feeling that. It wasn't the jolt to me that it was to everyone else because I had made physical moves, sold my house, like lots of things lots of losses, lots of changes, and I was already in that mode. So I could see it on other people's faces. And it is a great topic for Mental Health Month because grief of any kind really does affect your mental health if you aren't cognizant, maybe that's what you're going through. Like what is it when you feel depressed and you don't know why in this pandemic? Got to be loss of something, and that always triggers grief. So my perspective comes largely from losing a partner, but it parlays right into the whole feeling of grief and what you go through.
yeah,
And
can
the
we?
the layer of over grief is what we went through, which is trauma. And I had trauma, and this pandemic certainly is trauma. So trauma brings a whole other layer, I think, to grief and
Yeah. Can we
what we're
get
going
in?
through.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. Can we get a couple of like concrete examples when you say, for example, you were already in grief and so
Sure.
you recognized it in people who were just entering it because their grief began from the pandemic. Can you give us some ideas of what you saw so that it will help people listening recognize that?
I think it really hit me. I was on a Zoom call with a group that we were already meeting on Zoom, so it wasn't anything different. We had already started earlier that year. And one of the women in the beginning of this, normally she would be sitting at her desk and we would be talking. At this Zoom meeting, she was on her sofa with a blanket
Mm,
and clearly had been crying, and shoulders were slumped, and she was just despondent. And I said to her, "You're in grief. You are grieving what's going on." And she was pretty surprised at that. And
interesting.
she had had some earlier trauma in her life, so I think it that's the other thing about this grief and what you see, it re-energizes or resurfaces trauma that maybe you haven't dealt with. So that was one thing. I
And that's
think,
a great example because, like you said, I think so many of us, like I'll even say people, I've heard people joking about the COVID-19, and they're saying it's the 19 pounds on average that we've gained, right? But what's happening? So many people are turning to comfort foods. And you said with the woman that you just described, she's with a blanket, and what's more comforting than a blanket? And I
for
think when
sure.
you are in grief, you are looking for ways to comfort yourself. When you did mention it to the woman, and you said she was surprised, did was she receptive then to the thought, or was it too much to take on even?
Yeah, it was, I think, too much to take on. Like she was in a really deeply depressed, sad situation where I think that's sort of one of the earmarks of grief. You can't tell a griever pretty much anything
Mhm.
because you're so far in the tunnel that you just really, you're right, looking for comfort, anything that's comfort. And a lot of us found it in food
Mhm.
few these past few months, in the past year.
Yeah.
And those are signs. What do you look for? The spending a lot of time on the couch binge watching to escape. I know I did that, A, in grieving my partner, and B, in COVID.
Yeah.
And sometimes we weren't left had too many choices. But
Right. And there's nothing left for you to watch now, I bet. Right, right.
that's one of the first questions that comes up when I'm talking to other people is, what are you watching? Which
Right.
was never, right? We never asked that before. Maybe
No,
it came
no.
up in conversation, but didn't rise to the top.
Yeah.
So I think that that's
Yeah.
really interesting.
Yeah, I love the way you said it too, where you said when you're in that grief, you're so far into the tunnel. I think that the visual that brings into my mind is like, what do you have when you're in a tunnel? You have tunnel vision, right? Everything on the outside is blocked off. So I think I love the way you say that, and of course that goes back. I'm sure you've had plenty of time to think about that because of your perspective prescription that you talk about. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what do you do when you are in there, when you're in that tunnel, you don't necessarily realize it. What are some ways that you can kind of, clue into it, and maybe, what can you do?
Um, my suggestion is check in with your body. And here's a really interesting thing. When I said to that woman in another conversation about how she was feeling, and the trigger is, or the trigger to figure out where you are is how you feel it in your body. And she said to me, I don't feel things in my body. And I thought, well, now there you go. There's a
Yeah,
place to start, right? Because
yeah,
somewhere it shows up in your body. We carry everything in our bodies, right? And
yeah,
and it's one of the reasons that we focus on what we eat and what we do and exercise, because we want our bodies to feel good. But it's funny, when you're in grief, the feeling is the comfort. And it's really hard to move to, let's say, exercise, where cognitively we know it's going to make us feel better, but we can't make the leap, right?
yeah.
And um, breathing exercises are another, but man, they are hard to do when you are in there, because you really just, right, the less you breathe, the more sleepy you get, the more you can sort of just come out of your brain a little bit because you're not feeding it very much.
Yeah.
So those signs are you know good earmarks.
Yeah.
Check with your body.
Yeah, and something that you just mentioned, the breathing, and of course I'm a buteyko breathing specialist, so I'm right on board with that. And I'm thinking back to what you said about how the woman was sitting like with her shoulders rounded forward, and that is like the weight of the world idea on your shoulders,
For sure.
and that
Now I'm
does
sitting
is
up
yeah,
straight.
I know, quick reminder.
Sit up
Um,
straight.
yeah, but the thing is, that is actually it does act like a physical impediment to breathing, because once you start rounding your shoulders forward, your whole rib cage sort of gets compressed a little bit, and so when you're trying to breathe, you don't have as much freedom. And when the less you're able to breathe normally, the worse you're going to feel, right? And so it becomes this kind of catch 22. Yeah. So do you have another thought, or do you have a strategy that we want to move to?
Well, I one thing that I noticed, like before COVID came along, and I was just in really early grief, which for me was trauma because his death was very sudden. And I felt out of breath all the time, and I couldn't figure out why. And it was the strangest, really a strange feeling. And I did some investigation for another talk that I'm doing about perspective and weaving in COVID. And I looked up the physiological effects of stress and trauma. And sure enough, breathing is one of them. Um, Either over breathing, which I think I was doing, and you and I had a conversation at that time. And I think I said to you, I just feel out of breath all the time, and I don't feel like at the same time I can't get enough breath. And there is some breathing thing, breath is life. So when
Yes.
you're dealing with grief and you're really sad, you don't almost want to breathe. It almost hurts to breathe.
Yeah.
But what I loved was what you told me. Um, then maybe you want to repeat it, but I know it was about maybe I was taking in too much.
Too much air. Yeah, yeah. I'll start here. So we do, when we have a stress, in the body, we do change the way we breathe, right? And we do start using like our upper chest muscles and trying to recruit big amounts of air to quickly oxygenate the muscles. It's kind of like if you think back to the cavemen time and the saber-toothed tiger, you see that tiger there, you want to be able to power yourself up so you can run a short distance and get into the cave. And so that's what happens when you have some sort of trauma. But the only difference in modern life is we have the trauma, we start breathing in a different way, and then it doesn't really go away. Like we don't get away from that saber-toothed tiger, and all those chemicals that are released stay in the body, and we keep breathing in that way that isn't the way we're supposed to breathe over a sustained time. So yeah, so what I had described to you, and there's a video of this on my YouTube channel, was basically to do what I call the lilo breathing, like less in, less often, because when it helps you get out of that fight or flight nervous system mode and back into rest and digest. And I think the really important thing too with grief, when you've had some trauma like that, you need more sleep, right? Because the body is
For sure.
physically trying to heal. And so if you are breathing in a way that isn't the way you're supposed to breathe, your sleep is then disrupted. So if you can get back to breathing in the breathing that brings you into the rest and digest nervous system, then you can have better sleep and you can feel better, work through your grief in a potentially easier way than if you're not able to breathe and sleep.
So that's a good point that you bring up because typically when you're traumatized or have that sort of experience, and certainly COVID could be, the reason you don't sleep. Like that's one sign of depression, right? It's your inability to sleep. But the other that I thought of while you were talking was, what about crying? I mean, if you're crying, you're probably taking in big gulps of air, like everything is off, which I think is one of the reasons we feel so exhausted after we've been
Yeah,
crying also. And
yeah,
your body has to be totally, totally out of whack with your breathing and your sleep.
yeah,
And neither of those situations help at all. So
yeah.
I
That,
did do the exercises that you gave me. And I have to say they were not easy because they didn't feel natural under the circumstances. But that's, I think, part of what you do is get people to a point where the correct breathing for them is natural because they're doing all the right things in front of it. They don't have to concentrate on how they're breathing because everything is lined up behind it. to support that breathing. I
Yeah,
think that that's
actually,
really cool.
yeah, that's a great way that you're describing it. Is like you literally are, sort of reprogramming the respiration center in the brain. If you've developed poor daytime breathing habits, and I like the point that you made about the crying. Like if you are having those big heaving kind of crying, which you would be in that traumatic kind of loss, that is absolutely going to be the trigger for that. And I'll share something else that I heard that I wasn't aware of in terms of the crying. Crying does serve like a, a cathartic purpose, because all the chemicals that are coursing, are you familiar, right? They get
Absolutely.
rinsed out in the tears. So it's actually a little bit of a catch 22. I guess if you're going to cry, have a gentle cry, because if you cry and you have the big heave, you're sort of working against yourself. But no, either way, definitely do whatever you feel like you need to do. That's the
Well,
bottom line.
yes, but it is a fact that tears of joy have a different chemical composition than tears of sorrow, and that's why, because one is actually cleansing your system, which is really kind of cool. Like when we support our bodies the way they should be supported, they work really well.
Yeah.
And when they get out of whack, and I think sleep, just as a topic, is probably on the top of everyone's list. It's hard enough for most people to get enough hours of sleep, but if they're not getting what they need from their sleep, that's something that just builds on itself, and it's an endless loop of not ever feeling good, which is checking back in with your body again. And why don't I feel good? Like
Yeah.
people say I'm tired all the time, don't they? It's like
Yes.
the
Yes.
number one complaint.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, my mantra here on the Counterfeit Sleep podcast is to say, if you're not feeling great, then use the XYZ formula. And it's basically, if you have problem X, whatever it may be, if you're tired, you're angry, you're sad, you have stomach problems, whatever. If you have problem X, ask why, right? Don't just accept it. And then make your primary suspect your Z's, your sleep, because it really does impact everything. So, wow, this is, I think, really, I hope for me, actually, it opened my eyes on a couple of points. And I hope people will also, people who are listening will be able to appreciate a little bit more that the degree of grief that we're feeling is so great. And the chance that we're not aware of it is pretty great too, right? And so,
it,
like you said, check in. Yeah.
yeah, it definitely. And just one other thing to say about grief that I discovered, and I think we had this conversation before, but it it is a known fact that whatever your first experience of grief with is, whether it's losing your dog or moving when you're a kid to a different locale, any loss, the way that you are affected by that loss comes back every single subsequent loss. So it's another place. So if you stop breathing back then, you're gonna do the whole thing over again. And you know, sort of a shameless plug, one of the things having nothing to do with this podcast, by the way, is sub the title of my book is This Is Grief, because it's about losing a partner, but the subtitle is When Breathing Hurts,
Mm,
Love Songs Suck, and Good Days Come with Guilt. But
wow.
literally, I would say it hurts to breathe.
Yeah.
You're because you are so compressed and whatever. So
Yeah.
um, funny thing that's what we're talking about too. Not funny, but appropriate, because
Appropriate. Yes.
it was like number one for me. It's
Yeah. Yeah. And how often do we hear people say that, right? Like even just having let's just say a breakup, something much milder, right? You break up as a teen with somebody and
yeah,
it's just like, oh,
absolutely.
it hurts to breathe. It is.
That's
It's
grief.
it's a very physical experience. And I think too, when it hits you like that, you don't necessarily, it's like the elevator dropping out below you, and the depth to which you drop, you can't realize until you get out of it, really, right? Because it comes on and hits you. So I think, you know like I said, in our conversation here, if people can walk away either to recognize that they may be dealing with something more, or to see that maybe somebody that they know may be dealing with it. And I always say,
Really?
try
Yeah.
to, try to approach people who are feeling a little, they're off for some reason. Try to approach it with a little bit more grace, because maybe they don't even realize they're having, as hard a time as they are, and maybe a little support will just help open the floodgates a little bit, and that's how we make it through, right?
For sure, for sure. And I think too, and it's not a political statement at all, but I wonder in the process of grief, what was the role of masks? Um, in terms of that, you know what I mean? It's not disparaging anything, but I just think when you start to think about this topic, um, what does that mean? And
Yeah,
clearly we all appear to be fine, and that's a great thing. But
yeah.
it could be a struggling feeling too.
Yeah,
You don't
because
know so
the
much.
masks are, changing your breathing patterns. And, if you are already um, inclined to have, anxiety or something, the mask wearing is
Mm.
going to bring that on. It's going to heighten it dramatically, and so a range of mental health things could be directly attributed to masks, and the fear of all that's making us put the masks on. That is a huge factor as well. So good point. So Tanya, I have two last questions for you before we wrap up. So the first one is, I always like to ask our guests what they would put on a billboard. So you've had spent a lot of time with grief. You've, because of experiences and from just diving into it, now writing your book. Um, what would you put on a billboard knowing that it's a small piece of real estate and people go by it pretty quickly?
I got a million of them. I really just depends on the topic. I think one of the things that I like the most on the topic of grief where I'm at now is that there is life after death. Yours.
Oh my God. I love that, because it's such a common thing that we wonder about, life after death. But yeah, oh, beautiful, beautiful.
So if you lose somebody, your
Yeah.
life's not over, just theirs is over. And
Yes.
remember that.
Oh,
That's it. Don't waste, don't waste it. I don't want to waste the time. I don't know how much we don't know.
it's a
Don't
good
waste
point.
it.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Okay, thank you for that. So my last question for you is, I know you have your book coming out. Tell me the title again. I
It's
forget.
called This Is Grief,
Yeah.
where breathing hurts, love songs suck, and good days come with guilt. So
Beautiful.
it's intended to be, I think, a gift book. I think we tend to want to make people feel better, and this is not a how-to, what I did, what to do, no advice. It's just finding a kindred spirit in where you're at and saying, you know what, I'm not crazy. People
Yeah.
feel this way, so
Yeah.
that's what it's about, and it's scheduled to come out on August 20th, which is Grief Recognition Day. Who knew?
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah, so it will
I
be
love it.
available on Amazon and
Okay. The way you've described it, it makes me think of, like, when you have something going on and there's the person who will just sit with you and they don't want to talk unless you want to talk, or they'll listen if you just do, or they'll just be there so that you have comfort. Your book, the way you've described it, sounds a little bit like that to me. So,
that's
I
what
hope you,
I hope for. I hope that anyone who gets it can pick it up and something in it resonates with them where they feel not so alone.
yeah, that's the other thing about it too, that I know anytime I've ever been grieving, it's really hard to focus on stuff. You're not going to, there's no way you're picking up War and Peace and getting in
No,
for a
no,
you just don't have the mind for it,
no.
right? And it's like, if you have something that you can kind of thumb through and be engaged and engage as you want, then I think it's a beautiful gift for somebody to
I
be
hope
able to
so.
have that option. So So I look forward to seeing it in
Thanks.
August as well. Okay, so last question then, where would someone connect with you?
The easiest way I think is if I send you to my website, which is tanyadetrick.com, TANYADETRIK.com.
Beautiful. And I know you have your blog there too.
Hmm.
So that's always really well written, of course, because you are a writer, but also it's just so thought provoking, I think, and just really, really good
Thanks.
stuff. So I
Thank
would,
you.
yeah, you're welcome. Well, thank you so much again for joining us for National Mental Health Month. I really think we've shed some light on a really important topic for any time, but particularly now while there's just so much grief in the world. So thank you again, Tanya.
Thanks so much, Tara. It was a great conversation and I learned something, which I love.
And so did I, which I love as well. Thanks again.
Bye bye.